The Kushites' takeover of Egypt is a fascinating episode in ancient history, marked by political, military, and cultural shifts. The Kushite dynasty, often referred to as the 25th dynasty of Egypt, is especially notable because it represented the rise of an African power from the Kingdom of Kush, located to the south of Egypt, in modern-day Sudan, to the throne of Egypt. This was a rare instance of a foreign power ruling Egypt, and it had lasting implications for the history and culture of both Egypt and the broader region. Here's a detailed account of how the Kushites took over Egypt, including the historical background, key figures, and lasting impacts. 1. The Kingdom of Kush. Background: the Kingdom of Kush was located to the south of Egypt, centered around the area of modern-day Sudan. It was a powerful state that had close cultural, economic, and political ties with Egypt, particularly during the New Kingdom period, circa 1550 to 1070 BCE. The Kushites had their capital at Napata, near modern-day Karima in Sudan, and later at Meroe. Cultural influence: the Kushites were heavily influenced by Egyptian culture, adopting much of its religion, art, architecture, and even writing systems. The two civilizations had a long history of interaction, including trade and military alliances, and Egypt had been involved in the politics of Kush for centuries. Geopolitical context: by the time the Kushites began to rise to prominence, Egypt had entered a period of decline, with frequent invasions, internal strife, and weakening central authority. This created a power vacuum, which the Kushites were able to exploit. 2. Decline of Egypt. The Third Intermediate Period, c. 1070 to 664 BCE, after the fall of the New Kingdom around 1070 BCE, Egypt entered the Third Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation, weakening central authority, and division. Division into smaller kingdoms: Egypt fractured into smaller political entities. The northern part of Egypt, around Lower Egypt, was ruled by various local dynasties, including the Libyan dynasties. Meanwhile, Upper Egypt, southern Egypt, saw rule by native Egyptian families, but their power was often fragmented and divided. Assyrian influence: the Assyrian Empire to the northeast, which was growing in power during this period, began to intervene in Egypt's affairs. By the 8th century BCE, Assyrian influence was making its way into Egyptian politics. Weakened Egyptian rulers during this time were weak, and many local rulers struggled to maintain control over the country, especially against external threats and internal rebellion. This instability created opportunities for foreign powers like the Kushites to gain a foothold in Egypt. 3. The Rise of Kush, Pi and the conquest of Egypt. The actual takeover of Egypt by the Kushites began in the 8th century BCE under the leadership of Pi, also called Pianki, the king of Kush. Pi's early reign in Kush. Pianki, ruled c. 744 to 714 BCE, came to power in Kush during a period when Egypt was extremely divided and weak. Pi's kingdom was strong, and he had inherited a relatively powerful army and political infrastructure from his predecessors. Pi's ambition: Pi was not only concerned with expanding his kingdom but also with asserting dominance over Egypt. He saw Egypt's internal fragmentation and the weakening of its power as an opportunity to intervene. The invasion of Egypt, c. 740 BCE, Pianki's military campaign. Around 740 BCE, Pi decided to intervene in Egyptian affairs, initially offering help to the fragmented Egyptian rulers who were struggling against Libyan dynasties and the northern Egyptians. His intervention turned into a full-fledged military campaign, and he led his armies north into Egypt. Initial success: Pi's forces easily defeated the Egyptian rulers, and he quickly conquered the cities of Thebes and Hermopolis in Upper Egypt. His military campaign saw little resistance from the already weakened Egyptian dynasties. The Siege of Memphis. One of the key moments in the campaign was the Siege of Memphis, the capital of Lower Egypt. After a brief period of conflict, the city's Egyptian ruler, Tefnakti, was forced to submit to Pi. Pi's entry into Egypt: after his victory, Pi entered Memphis as a conqueror, and the Egyptian rulers officially acknowledged him as their superior. Pi also imposed his authority over Egypt's various smaller cities and territories. See Pi's rule over Egypt. Pi's coronation. After completing his conquest of Egypt, Pi was crowned as the ruler of both Kush and Egypt, marking the beginning of the 25th dynasty, also known as the Kushite dynasty. His coronation was significant because it united the two lands of Kemet, Egypt, and Kush under one rule. Pi's governance. Pi ruled Egypt from his base in Thebes, the southern capital, but his influence stretched throughout the land. Although Pi's direct rule in Lower Egypt was somewhat limited, he maintained control over the entire country through a system of vassal rulers. These vassal rulers acknowledged Pi as their overlord and pledged their allegiance. Pi's religious legitimacy. To legitimize his rule over Egypt, Pi also aligned himself with Egyptian religious practices. He emphasized his role as a protector of Egyptian temples, particularly those dedicated to the gods Amun and Ra, and ensured that Egyptian religious practices were maintained under his rule. Pianki's legacy. Pi ruled Egypt for about a decade, and his reign helped to stabilize Egypt for a time. However, his successor, Shabaka, would go on to solidify the Kushite rule even further. 4. The 25th dynasty of Egypt. The Golden Age of Kushite rule. The 25th dynasty, which lasted from 747 to 656 BCE, saw the full consolidation of Kushite rule over Egypt, and it became a remarkable period in both Egyptian and Kushite history. Shabaka, c. 716 to 702 BCE, Shabaka was the successor of Pi and continued his father's policies. He established a more centralized rule, with strong governance over both Upper and Lower Egypt. Shabaka also initiated building projects, restoring temples and monuments, and reinforcing Egypt's religious traditions. He further aligned his reign with the powerful god Ammonius, which helped cement his status in Egyptian society. Taharka, c. 690 to 664 BCE, Taharka, another important figure of the 25th dynasty, ruled during the height of Kushite power in Egypt. Under his reign, Egypt enjoyed prosperity, and the Kingdom of Kush became a dominant force in the region. Taharka's reign was marked by massive building projects, including the restoration of the Great Temple of Ammonius at Karnak and the construction of monumental statues. He also faced military challenges from the Assyrians, who were expanding westward, and ultimately, his forces were defeated by the Assyrians, signaling the decline of Kushite rule. 5. Decline of the 25th dynasty and the fall of the Kushites. Assyrian invasion. In the mid-7th century BCE, the rising power of the Assyrian Empire presented a direct threat to the Kushite dynasty. In 664 BCE, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal launched an invasion of Egypt and defeated the forces of Taharka's successor, Tanatamani. The Assyrians took control of much of Egypt, and the Kushite rulers were pushed out of the country. End of the Kushite dynasty. With the loss of Egypt to the Assyrians, the Kushites were forced to retreat back to their homeland in Kush. While the Kushite rulers maintained power in their native kingdom for several more centuries, the 25th dynasty's rule over Egypt came to an end. 6. Legacy of the Kushite rule in Egypt. Cultural influence. Despite their relatively short rule, the Kushites left a lasting impact on Egyptian culture. They revived many pharaonic traditions, including monumental architecture, temple construction, and religious practices centered on the god Ammonius. Political unification. The Kushite dynasty's rule marked a rare moment of political unification in Egypt during a time of fragmentation. The Kushites brought a sense of stability and centralized governance that had been lacking in Egypt for centuries. Kushite identity. The Kushites also left a lasting legacy in the way Egyptians viewed their southern neighbors. While the Kushites were often portrayed in Egyptian records as foreign conquerors, their reign highlighted the influence and power of Nubian kingdoms in the ancient world. In conclusion, the Kushites took over Egypt during a period of weakness in the Egyptian state, and their rule represented the rise of a powerful African kingdom that ruled Egypt for nearly a century. The 25th dynasty marked a high point in the cultural and political relations between Egypt and Kush, but it ultimately ended with the Assyrian invasion. Despite their short reign, the Kushites' influence on Egypt's religious, cultural, and architectural legacy endured long after their departure.